They studied the reports with the comfortable confidence of men who believed they understood their enemy. In late 1941, as the first clashes in North Africa filtered through the channels of German command, senior officers gathered around sand-dusted tables and declared the Americans unprepared for a continental war. Their assessments were cool, almost clinical. The United States had numbers, yes, but no discipline, no instinct for the field. To them, the new arrivals were a force learning to walk on ground that veterans had long since mastered. Among the papers was a recently intercepted transmission, lightly creased as though handled without concern. It quoted a German general who had watched the Americans at a distance and dismissed them with a single phrase: "A force without steel." The line carried an air of finality, as though the matter required no further examination. In those early months, judgment came easily. At Kasserine Pass, the Germans believed their assumptions confirmed. The landscape itself, broken ridges, narrow routes, and hard desert wind, seemed to favor the seasoned Wehrmacht. Miscommunication rippled through inexperienced American units. Command posts shifted under pressure. Columns dissolved into uncertainty as German maneuver warfare cut through their positions with practiced precision. To Rommel's staff, the scene felt less like a battle than a lesson being repeated. The Americans were green, reactive, and slow to adjust. From their headquarters, they reached a conclusion that would shape their strategic posture for months. They believed America's vaunted industrial strength was exaggerated, a myth carried across the Atlantic by propaganda and inflated by Roosevelt's rhetoric. In their diaries, officers wrote that the United States was a nation of factories, not fighters, as though production and courage could not coexist. The early failures seemed to affirm everything they wished to believe. Yet the desert held its own quiet truths. Early collapse is rarely a measure of final capacity, and first impressions often disguise the deeper momentum of a nation still gathering its breath. What the Germans read as weakness was, in reality, an army in its first, painful stage of transformation. And far from the ridgelands of Kasserine, in factories the Germans scarcely considered, a different kind of power was beginning to stir, one that would soon challenge every assumption written in those confident diaries. German intelligence built its assessments on familiar metrics: tactical sharpness, battlefield instinct, the immediate rhythm of attack and counterattack. In these narrow frames, the Americans remained an ill-prepared force struggling to master the fundamentals of desert warfare. Analysts pored over after-action reports from Kasserine and saw only what confirmed their preconceptions. They measured platoons breaking under pressure, not the machinery of a nation preparing to fight a long war. In doing so, they judged the surface of events while missing the deeper current beneath. From these early failures, a broader belief took shape, that the setbacks reflected a cultural flaw rather than raw inexperience. To German officers shaped by decades of professional soldiery, the American collapse seemed almost inevitable. They viewed U.S. command structures as diffuse, its discipline untested, its soldiers too briefly trained to endure sustained operations. Few paused to consider that armies evolve, and that early missteps often mark the beginning, not the limit, of institutional learning. Across the Atlantic, the tone was markedly different. The shock of Kasserine forced American officers into uncomfortable reflection. Reports circulated with an honesty born of necessity: failures in coordination, gaps in leadership, and the need for clearer doctrine. Within weeks, training cycles shifted, command relationships tightened, and reforms began moving through the ranks with a speed that belied the image of a complacent force. The Americans understood they had been beaten, and resolved that they would not be beaten the same way again. Meanwhile, on the industrial horizon, another reality unfolded. U.S. shipyards, operating around the clock, launched Liberty ships in a rhythm that no intelligence estimate had truly accounted for. German submarines prowled the Atlantic with lethal efficiency, yet their successes were soon overshadowed by the relentless pace of American production. Each vessel launched carried a quiet message. The war Germany believed it was fighting was not the war America intended to fight. Amid this transformation, young American soldiers wrote home with a candid mixture of fear and purpose. They described confusion in the desert, the sting of failure, and a steady, growing resolve to master the craft their nation now demanded of them. In their words lay the beginnings of a force reinventing itself. What German analysts could not yet see was that this same force, mocked for its inexperience, would soon gather the strength to attempt the largest amphibious invasion in human history. an operation already forming beyond the edge of their assumptions. Across the Atlantic, far from the sand and smoke of North Africa, a different kind of meeting was underway. In Washington, President Franklin Roosevelt gathered industrial leaders in rooms crowded with charts, procurement schedules, and the quiet urgency of a nation preparing for total mobilization. The conversation was measured but absolute. America would not fight this war with fragments of its economy. It would fight with the full weight of its industrial potential, awakened and directed toward a single purpose. In those early conferences, the blueprint of modern warfare began to take form. By 1943, the scale of that decision revealed itself in ways no Axis planner had fully anticipated. Shipyards launched vessels with a rhythm more reminiscent of agriculture than industry, steady, predictable, seasonless. Aircraft plants expanded into skylines of steel trusses and glass, producing fighters and bombers faster than German workshops could repair the damage from the last raid. Quietly, almost without ceremony, American output surpassed the combined production of Germany, Italy, and Japan. It was a shift not marked by parades, but by numbers stacked higher each month. Yet in German planning circles, confidence remained. Quality, they argued, would prevail over quantity. The precision of German engineering, the finesse of its designs, the discipline of its craftsmen, these, they believed, would counter the flood coming from American factories. But even within their own scientific enclaves, doubts began to surface. At Peenemünde, engineers working on advanced rockets recorded progress in their notebooks with a hint of unease. Their designs grew more ambitious, yet the nation around them lacked the steel, fuel, and stable production lines required to turn prototypes into reality. Breakthroughs meant little without the means to multiply them. Meanwhile, American standardization became a strategic weapon. Factories produced millions of identical rifles, trucks, and tanks, interchangeable parts moving through global supply lines with mechanical predictability. Uniformity, once considered uninspired, now proved decisive. It allowed replacements to arrive before shortages could form, and ensured that an army learning to fight could do so with equipment that never changed beneath their hands. In these vast workshops, women stepped into roles once closed to them, running lathes, welding hulls, and assembling engines with a precision equal to any craftsman. Their presence reshaped not only the workforce, but the meaning of the home front itself, a reminder that total war required every citizen, not only the soldier. Nations rarely lose through a single battle. More often, they falter by misreading the future. And while Germany measured the war by the weapons it already possessed, America was building the arsenal of a conflict still unfolding, one that would soon reach the shores of Europe. The Wehrmacht entered 1943 carrying a conviction shaped by early victories and reinforced by doctrine. That battlefield skill could overcome any industrial imbalance. To German officers raised in the traditions of decisive maneuver, disciplined infantry, and finely tuned weaponry, the war would be won by the sharper blade, not the larger forge. This belief did not emerge from arrogance alone, but from experience. Poland, France, the Balkans, each campaign confirming the supremacy of training and tempo. In this worldview, American strength, however vast, lacked the refinement required for continental warfare. In Tunisia, that assumption found further encouragement. Veteran German formations, many with years of combat behind them, observed that American troops still struggled under pressure. At Fade and along the eastern dorsal, the same patterns seemed to repeat: hesitation at the point of decision, units falling back when enveloped, and an apparent lack of cohesion when the battlefield turned fluid. To the German eye, these were not temporary missteps, but markers of an army unsuited to a long, grinding conflict. Reports carried back to Europe reinforced the narrative. Americans could fight, yes, but only until the field demanded resilience forged by hardship. Some officers wrote even more bluntly. In their diaries, they argued that the United States lacked not only experience, but the cultural tolerance for the heavy casualties required to fight on the European continent. Behind their words lay an old assumption: democracies fracture under pressure, while authoritarian systems endure. The belief was seldom questioned. It offered predictability amidst the widening uncertainties of the war. Yet while German commanders studied the battlefield, American leaders studied their own mistakes. Under Eisenhower in theater and General George Marshall in Washington, training reforms in 10. Sci-fied with disciplined urgency. Doctrine was rewritten, leadership purged where necessary, and staff procedures tightened. The Americans approached warfare not as an inherited craft, but as a system, one that could be measured, evaluated, and improved. What Germany read as weakness was, in reality, a process of rapid assimilation, fueled by a nation unafraid to dissect its own failures. As 1943 progressed, this process became visible in the field. American units began to integrate armor, infantry, artillery, and air support with growing confidence. Combined arms operations, once a hallmark of German success, were now practiced in exercises across North Africa with methodical precision. Fire support became more responsive. Logistics became more predictable. Commanders learned to synchronize vast resources in a way Germany had once assumed only it could achieve. The pace of adaptation, not its scale, was what caught Allied observers by surprise. German dismissiveness, however, persisted. The Wehrmacht focused on the immediate battlefield picture and saw only marginal improvements, not the deeper transformation underway. Their confidence, long an asset, gradually hardened into a strategic blind spot. They underestimated not only American strength but American velocity, the speed at which a democracy could mobilize, learn, and adjust. Arrogance, once the quiet companion of German planning, now began to reshape their decisions in ways they did not yet perceive. And across the Mediterranean, the consequences of that misjudgment were already gathering, preparing to reveal themselves in the next campaign. In Berlin, the German High Command placed much of its confidence in concrete and geometry. The Atlantic Wall, an immense chain of bunkers, gun batteries, and interlocking obstacles, was presented as the shield that would render any Allied landing improbable, if not impossible. Its very scale encouraged complacency. Commanders believed that even a determined enemy would hesitate before its cliffs and fortifications, and that the wall's presence alone would deter an invasion across the Channel. In their calculations, the Americans lacked the resolve or sophistication to challenge such a barrier. Yet these calculations were shaped by a strategic blindness. Reports from the Eastern Front consumed the attention of Germany's senior leadership. The clash with the Soviet Union demanded every available division, every trainload of ammunition, every hour of deliberation. Compared to the vast struggle in the East, the Western approaches seemed almost static, a secondary theater that required only modest reinforcement. The assumption took hold that the Americans, still regarded as inexperienced, would not act decisively while the Wehrmacht fought for its life in Russia. It was a comforting belief, and therefore rarely questioned. As American preparations intensified, German intelligence observed convoys, supply depots, and doctrinal publications, but dismissed them as further proof of bureaucratic excess. Where the Germans saw an overcomplicated system weighed down by paperwork, the Americans saw a method to ensure that every battalion arriving in Europe would fight with predictable support. Manuals on logistics, combined arms cooperation, and amphibious planning were printed in quantities that astounded German analysts, who assumed such administrative detail reflected weakness rather than discipline. The irony was that these documents, often mocked, would later hold the structural logic of the largest invasion ever attempted. Meanwhile, American armored doctrine was undergoing a quiet transformation. After months of combat data from Tunisia, officers studied the performance of the M4 Sherman against the Panzer IV and Tiger tanks. Field reports noted the Sherman's vulnerabilities, but also its reliability, mobility, and capacity for rapid production. Engineers and tacticians responded not by abandoning the design, but by refining its application, coordinating armor with anti-tank guns, artillery, and air support to offset German advantages. This systematic approach contrasted sharply with German expectations, which still imagined American tank crews as green soldiers dependent on luck rather than coordination. These reforms were reinforced by a deeply human resolve. In North African hospitals, American officers walked past beds filled with soldiers wounded at Kasserine. The rooms smelled of antiseptic and desert dust, and the faces they saw were young, exhausted, and often ashamed of their first encounter with seasoned enemies. Officers who had witnessed the chaos firsthand made quiet vows beside those bedsides. The mistakes that cost these men so dearly would not be repeated. Training would harden. Doctrine would clarify. Leadership would mature. The army that would return to Europe would not resemble the one that had stumbled in Tunisia. But German planners remained, convinced that morale would crack once American units faced cease. Ned divisions like the 352nd Infantry or the 21st Panzer. They believed elite formations, shaped by years of attrition, would overwhelm an army they still viewed as untested. It was a belief rooted less in evidence than in habit, a continuation of the dismissive assessments formed in earlier campaigns. And so the irony deepened. As German commanders assumed their enemy unprepared, the Americans prepared with meticulous patience, shaping an invasion force designed not for the war Germany imagined, but for the war that was coming. The discrepancy between expectation and reality was widening, and soon it would break open on the shores of Western Europe. Across occupied France, German labor battalions worked under a mounting sense of exhaustion. By 1944, shortages of manpower, machinery, and transport meant that the Atlantic Wall, advertised as a fortress stretching from Norway to the Bay of Biscay, could not be built to the scale its architects had promised. In Normandy, the gaps were unmistakable: unlaid minefields, incomplete bunkers, and anti-tank obstacles waiting for materials that never arrived. Yet the leadership in Berlin continued to describe the defenses as impregnable, as if confidence itself could fill the empty trenches. Amid this atmosphere of proclaimed strength and hidden weakness, Erwin Rommel walked the coastline with a practiced eye. Having fought the British and Americans in North Africa, he understood the enormity of what U.S. industry could deliver. In his reports, he warned that once the Allies established a foothold, their factories, operating 3 shifts a day, would pour men, armor, and supplies into Europe at a pace the Wehrmacht could not match. He insisted the invasion must be defeated on the beaches, before American numbers overcame German precision. But his warnings, couched in the urgency of lived experience, clashed with the assumptions of a high command that still believed industrial mass could not outweigh German skill. Many of his concerns faded into the bureaucracy of wishful thinking. This complacency was reinforced by deception, carefully constructed, deliberately misleading, and brilliantly executed. Allied Operation Fortitude projected the illusion of a massive invasion force preparing to strike at Pas-de-Calais. Inflatable tanks, falsified radio traffic, and double agents pushed German intelligence toward the conclusion it already preferred: that Normandy was unlikely, that the real blow would fall where the channel narrowed. Instead of correcting German misjudgment, Fortitude deepened it, allowing belief to masquerade as analysis. While Germany fortified selectively and planned under false assumptions, the Americans trained with increasing intensity. Amphibious drills unfolded along the British coast in vast simulations, complete with naval gunfire, landing craft coordination, and the complex choreography of infantry, armor, and engineers moving from sea to land. The scale was unprecedented. Thousands of vessels practicing synchronized landings under conditions designed to mimic the chaos of real combat. What had once been a weakness at Kasserine was being overwritten by repetition, doctrine, and a determination to master the craft of invasion. Amid these preparations, GIs reflected on their earliest encounters with war. Letters and diary entries reveal a blend of humility and resolve, memories of failure transformed into motivation. Many remembered the confusion of Tunisia, the disorientation of their first bombardment, the shock of meeting veterans who maneuvered with instinctive confidence. Now, months later, they marched, drilled, and studied with a sense that their past mistakes had become the foundation of something stronger. Embarrassment had hardened into resolve, and resolve into competence. Yet in Germany, faith in the Atlantic Wall had become more than strategy. It was a psychological barrier shielding leaders from the reality of diminishing resources, collapsing logistics, and a two-front war they no longer controlled. The wall stood not only in concrete, but in the minds of those who needed to believe the impossible was still achievable. And so the stage formed for a collision between an army preparing with disciplined clarity and a command structure clinging to assumptions that no longer reflected the world around them. What came next would reveal which belief could endure contact with reality. The transformation of the United States Army did not occur in a single moment, nor through a single decision. It emerged through the accumulation of hard lessons, many paid for in the heat and confusion of North Africa. After the shocks of Tunisia, American doctrine was retooled with a clarity that only failure can produce. Fire and maneuver, once theoretical concepts studied in classrooms, were refined into practical rhythms supported by artillery, armor, and air power. Leadership changed as well. Officers unable to adapt were rotated out, replaced by those who demonstrated the cool discipline required to command under pressure. Logistics, often invisible to the battlefield observer, became a tightly synchronized instrument. ensuring that men, fuel, and ammunition moved with predictable precision. The first test of this evolving doctrine came not on the plains of Europe, but in the surf of Sicily. Operation Husky turned the island into a laboratory for amphibious warfare, exposing every weakness and every strength of Allied planning. Landings depended on exact timing and sequencing, with infantry, engineers, and armor arriving in coordinated waves. Beach engineering became an art in itself, clearing obstacles, marking lanes, and improvising under fire. Each misstep was documented. Each small success became part of a growing manual of amphibious tactics. The Americans learned that mastery of the sea-to-shore transition required not only boldness, but an almost mathematical sense of order. Behind these operations stood the U.S. Navy, reshaping maritime warfare on a scale no other nation could equal. Naval architects designed new landing craft capable of carrying tanks, heavy vehicles, and entire platoons directly onto hostile beaches. Gunfire support evolved from isolated bombardments to sustained, precisely timed barrages synchronized with infantry advances. The idea of floating harbors, structures large enough to sustain entire armies, shifted from bold theory to active development. In dry docks and testing yards, the tools of future landings were being forged with industrial efficiency. German intelligence registered many of these improvements, but rarely grasped their significance. Analysts noted better coordination, more polished landings, and increased American confidence, yet they interpreted these developments as incremental rather than transformative. To them, the Americans were refining methods already understood by the British or pioneered elsewhere. They failed to see that while Germany improved at the margins, the United States was redefining the very structure of modern warfare. Training reflected this shift. Across English fields and coastal ranges, GIs marched long distances beneath heavy loads, rehearsing maneuvers again and again until muscle memory replaced hesitation. Night exercises became routine, challenging soldiers to navigate terrain and coordinate fire under darkness. Live fire drills brought the sound and pressure of combat into controlled spaces, teaching discipline amid noise and confusion. The men who had once been shaken by their first encounter with German veterans were now shaped into a force capable of meeting them on equal terms. Within this expanding system, American engineers began imagining solutions to challenges that had not yet fully emerged. The Mulberry harbors, massive artificial ports to be assembled off enemy shores, were conceptualized in workshops filled with diagrams, scale models, and quiet determination. Amphibious tanks were adapted for rough surf conditions, their design reflecting a sober understanding of what the channel's unpredictable waters might demand. Every innovation emerged from the same recognition. The invasion of Europe would require abilities no existing army possessed. The Americans did not seek to match German tactics blow for blow. They aimed to outproduce, outcoordinate, and outsustain them. Their strength would not lie in a single weapon or a single battlefield maneuver, but in a system designed to project power across oceans, through storms, and onto defended coasts. It was warfare conceived as an enterprise rather than a duel. And as these preparations deepened, a new reality took shape, one Germany had not yet fully seen. The army forged in the desert was now being refined in the sea, preparing for an operation whose scale would render earlier judgments obsolete. The next test would unfold not in training grounds or laboratories, but on a coastline Germany believed it had already secured. Across Britain, in warehouses, rail yards, and hurriedly expanded ports, the silent machinery of war began to gather. Operation Bolero, the great transatlantic buildup, became the largest logistical undertaking in military history. It was not shaped by battles or headlines, but by ledgers, shipping manifests, and the disciplined movement of material across an ocean. Month after month, Liberty ships and troop transports made the crossing, their holds packed with the tools of a future invasion. The scale astonished even those directing it. Millions of tons of equipment, from rifle cartridges to locomotives, moved with the steady rhythm of a nation that had learned to turn industry into strategy. Germany, watching through the fog of incomplete intelligence, believed such an effort impossible to conceal. The assumption rested on an older view of warfare, one in which armies were limited by the pace of their supply lines and the fragility of their transports. But the Americans were doing something unprecedented. They were assembling a force so immense, so systematically supported, that the traditional limits seemed to fall away. Materiel flowed not in bursts but in tides, and every tide left Britain heavier with the weight of coming events. To sustain this arrival, engineers worked with relentless urgency. British ports were dredged and expanded, their docks strengthened to receive ships that dwarfed anything seen in earlier wars. Airfields stretched across the countryside, concrete runways carved into farmland, hangars rising like vast barns of steel. Motor pools filled entire valleys with row after row of olive-drab vehicles, each tagged, serviced, and assigned to a purpose. Supply depots grew outward until they blurred into the horizon, stacked with crates whose labels traced the geography of American industry. Detroit engines, Pittsburgh steel, Iowa grain, California rubber. Even before the first American soldier set foot on the beaches of Normandy, plans were underway for what would follow. The Red Ball Express, an all-weather round-the-clock system of truck convoys, was drafted months before the invasion. It anticipated not merely victory on D-Day but a rapid breakout across France. Its architects imagined clogged roads, broken bridges, and the relentless need for fuel as armored divisions pushed inland. Their calculations were not optimistic or pessimistic. They were precise, built on the understanding that speed would be decisive. In this vision, logistics became a weapon as sharp as any blade. Across the Channel, German divisions faced a different reality. Their supply lines, strained by years of attrition, delivered too little and too late. Fuel arrived in dribbles. Ammunition stocks shrank. Spare parts became so rare that damaged vehicles were cannibalized to keep a handful running. Commanders accustomed to careful, tactical maneuver found themselves constrained by shortages that could not be solved by discipline or bravery. To them, the abundance gathering in Britain seemed almost beyond comprehension, a level of preparation they could neither match nor fully imagine. Yet within this vast logistical enterprise, the work remained deeply human. Clerks bent over typewriters, translating requisitions into orders. Drivers slept beside their trucks, engines cooling in the damp English night. Quartermasters walked through depots the size of small towns, tracking inventory with pencils worn down to stubs. None would appear in official communiques or after-action reports, yet their labor formed the invisible muscle of D-Day. Without them, the soldiers who stormed the beaches would have carried empty rifles, stepped into unpowered tanks, and fought without the assurance that reinforcements would come. The deeper truth was one often overlooked in military history. Wars are rarely won by those who fire the bullets. They are won by those who deliver them. Victory belongs not only to the men who charge forward, but to the quiet, unseen multitude ensuring that forward is always possible. And as the spring of 1944 approached, the machinery of supply had reached its full momentum, ready to support an operation whose scale Germany still believed could not, and would not, be attempted. Dwight D. Eisenhower approached the coming invasion with a principle shaped by the hard mathematics of modern war. Victory must rest not on balance, but on certainty. He called for overwhelming superiority in every category: ships, aircraft, armor, manpower, insisting on what he termed a margin beyond doubt. The scale he demanded exceeded anything previously attempted. Each staff meeting, each logistical review pushed the boundaries further. The invasion would not hinge on audacity alone. It would succeed because no other outcome would be allowed. As these preparations matured, German defenders across northern France fortified their bunkers with the confidence of soldiers expecting a familiar enemy. They knew the Allies were gathering, but they could not fathom the magnitude of what approached. Beyond the horizon, where the gray of sea met the gray of sky, the largest armada in human history was forming. Thousands of vessels, transports, destroyers, battleships, landing craft, stretched across the channel in rehearsals that resembled the migration of a steel continent. To the men on deck, the operation felt less like a single assault and more like the opening movement of an entire world shifting westward. The Allies prepared not only through strength, but through detail. Meteorologists refined forecasts with unprecedented precision, scanning the Atlantic for the small weather windows that might allow landings. Oceanographers charted tide tables and beach gradients along Normandy's coast, mapping where tanks might bog down and where men could advance. Specialists studied sand composition, cliff approaches, and hidden shoals. Every variable, wind, surf, moonlight, was quantified, tested, rehearsed. These elements, invisible to German planners, formed a layer of preparation far deeper than the enemy imagined. Meanwhile, the battle for the air had already been decided. By early 1944, Allied air superiority was so complete that German aircraft rarely reached the invasion corridor at all. Rail lines across France had been cut, their twisted metal strewn across embankments where trains once carried ammunition and fuel. Communication nodes lay in rubble. Convoys moved at night slowly under constant threat. Reinforcements that Germany intended to send to Normandy in the critical first hours would instead crawl forward in fragments, delayed by the systematic destruction of every artery feeding the front. Air power, once a support tool, had become a scalpel, shaping the battlefield before the first soldier touched the shore. On the ground in Britain, American training evolved into a ritual marked by repetition and discipline. Units practiced obstacle clearing under simulated fire, rehearsing the destruction of mines, wire, and concrete barriers with mechanical precision. Fire support coordination became second nature. Infantry, tanks, engineers, and naval guns acting as synchronized parts of a single machine. Casualty evacuation drills ensured that wounded men could be pulled from the surf or lifted from the sand within minutes. The training fields echoed not with bravado, but with an understanding that lives depended on mastering these routines long before they confronted the real tide. Yet across the Channel, German confidence remained largely unshaken. Officers along the Atlantic Wall believed that the Allies, no matter their numbers, would falter at the waterline. They trusted in the strength of their fortifications, the sharpness of their veterans, and the assumption that an army shaped by comfort would struggle under fire. Their belief rested on fragments of earlier encounters, on reports from North Africa and Italy, and on the enduring conviction that German soldiers possessed an inherent superiority of will. Few imagined that the Americans arriving in Britain were no longer the force they had once faced. What the Germans did not see was the quiet perfection taking shape behind the ocean. An army mocked as inexperienced had become an institution of methodical power. Logistics had been transformed into strategy. Training had been sharpened into instinct. Air dominance had become a shield extending from the White Cliffs to the beaches of Normandy. And Eisenhower's demand for overwhelming force, once treated as aspirational, had solidified into reality. The most underestimated army in the world now stood ready, its strength concealed not by secrecy, but by the enemy's unwavering belief that such strength could not exist. And soon, the Channel would reveal what belief had obscured. Dawn came slowly on June 6, 1944, a thin gray light spreading across the Channel as German observation posts scanned the water. At first, the horizon appeared blurred, as though the sea itself were swelling unnaturally. Then the shapes resolved, columns of ships, lines of landing craft, silhouettes of battleships and transports layered so densely that the ocean seemed paved with steel. Reports rushed inland with an urgency that bordered on disbelief. The sentries had expected raids, feints, perhaps even a bold landing. But nothing in their training prepared them for an armada that stretched beyond the curvature of the earth. In that moment, assumptions forged over years began to shatter. This was not the hesitant, disorganized force the Germans believed they had met in North Africa. The discipline of the formations, the synchronization of escort vessels and landing craft, the sheer number of aircraft already streaking overhead, all signaled an adversary transformed. The Americans had not merely improved, they had rebuilt themselves into a force able to choreograph the movements of hundreds of thousands. German officers watching from the bluffs felt a rare sensation. The quiet dread of realizing an old judgment had become dangerously outdated. Along Omaha Beach, the battle intensified into one of the most desperate struggles of the war. The first waves of American infantry were pinned by interlocking machine gun fire, their advance slowed by tide, obstacles, and exposed sand. Seeing the assault begin to falter, U.S. destroyers moved in with extraordinary resolve. Despite the danger of running aground, they closed to ranges so short that their guns fired almost horizontally into the German positions. Their salvos erupted against the bluffs, smashing strongpoints that had survived aerial bombardment. The captains held their ships steady under the glare of coastal guns, knowing that without this support the beach might never be taken. It was a calculated act of near-suicidal courage, executed with the calm precision of men who understood the cost of hesitation. Over the hedgerows and fields, American paratroopers faced a different test. Scattered by wind, cloud, and anti-aircraft fire, they descended from their designated drop zones, yet the disarray did not paralyze them. Small groups formed in the dark, gathering stragglers, orienting themselves with quick maps drawn in dirt, and striking at German patrols and crossroads. Their improvisation confounded German defensive plans. Intended to form a coherent attack axis, the paratroopers instead became 1,000 small blades, cutting communication lines and isolating strongpoints. Their actions, often measured in minutes and meters, shaped the battlefield far more profoundly than any planner had predicted. By mid-morning, German artillery commanders reported scenes that strained description. They spoke of unimaginable coordination of sea and sky, of naval rounds crashing into positions just as aircraft descended through cloud breaks to strafe and bomb. Attempts to shift reserves were disrupted by this relentless pressure. Messages arrived late or not at all. Batteries fired, repositioned, and were struck moments later by counterfire directed from ships they could not even see. What had once been a battlefield governed by their timing was now orchestrated by an enemy whose reach extended from the depths of the channel to the highest altitude above it. On the beaches, the human struggle continued with a quiet determination that defined the day. GIs crawled through surf and shingle, inching forward despite exhaustion, fear, and the weight of soaked equipment. Few spoke of glory, most thought only of the next few yards, the next patch of cover, the next order. Discipline carried them where adrenaline could not, and the sense of duty, shaped by years of training and the memory of earlier mistakes, pushed them through fire that should have broken them. They were no longer the untested soldiers of Kasserine. They were the product of reform, repetition, and resolve. As reports filtered to German headquarters, a stark realization spread through the command structure. The Americans they had once dismissed as a force without steel had become a war machine, vast, coordinated, and unyielding. What had been mocked as quantity had revealed itself as quality of a different kind. The quality of organization, of production, of sustained force applied with relentless precision. By the end of that morning, the German Empire had not yet fallen, but in the thunder of naval guns, in the steady advance of drenched soldiers, and in the skies filled with aircraft, the shape of its fate became unmistakable. The day had broken not only upon the beaches, but upon the assumptions that once seemed unshakable, and the next hours would drive the point even deeper into history. By late morning on June 6th, the German command began to feel the fracture lines within its own defenses. Reinforcements that should have reached the coast in hours instead took entire days. Bridges lay in twisted heaps of steel, collapsed by Allied bombers in the weeks before the invasion. Roads, already narrow, winding, and overburdened, were cratered so deeply that trucks had to weave through fields simply to advance a few miles. Messages sputtered through damaged lines, distorted or arriving too late to matter. What the German generals had once called an impregnable wall now resembled a series of isolated strongpoints, each fighting without the lifelines required to survive. On the beaches, the Americans faced their own brutal realities. Fire swept across the sand in sweeping arcs, pinning down units that struggled to advance beyond the tidal flats. But amid the chaos, U.S. engineers began the slow, deliberate work that would determine the day. Under a storm of machine gun fire and shell bursts, they crawled forward to clear mines, blast wire, and carve passages off the beach. Their progress came in feet, not yards, each small gap a doorway through which the invasion could expand. Every fallen engineer meant another man stepping forward to take his tools, continuing the task with the same measured resolve. As these exits widened, the tide of materiel waiting offshore began to move inland. Sherman tanks, delayed, battered, and in some sectors nearly absent in the first hours, finally reached solid ground. Their arrival changed the texture of the fight. German defenders, who had held back waves of infantry through sheer discipline and firepower, now faced armor advancing in concert with riflemen. The Americans moved with a practiced rhythm, coordinating cover, suppressive fire, and movement as they had rehearsed countless times on British soil. Missteps still occurred, but the overall pattern was unmistakable. The lessons of North Africa and Sicily had become instinct. German units, many composed of veterans hardened by years of war, fought with undeniable courage. Their machine gun nests remained deadly. Their artillery crews worked with precision even as ammunition dwindled. But courage alone could not alter the balance now visible across the horizon. Each hour saw more Allied ships unloading, more vehicles reaching. Sure, more men reinforcing the front. The defenders were fighting against not one army, but a system, an industrial, logistical, and operational force that Germany had never believed its enemy capable of constructing. In the midst of this collapse, Rommel's earlier warnings returned with cruel clarity. He had argued that defeat must be inflicted on the beaches before the Americans could exploit their overwhelming depth. Now his prediction unfolded in real time. With every passing hour, the beach had expanded, sand giving way to fields, fields connecting to roads, and roads linking to objectives farther inland. Once the Americans secured these footholds, removal became impossible. The Atlantic Wall, for all its concrete and steel, had never been designed to hold back an enemy capable of arriving in such numbers and sustaining itself with such precision. American casualties were heavy. Medics worked continuously, dragging wounded men to improvised stations behind dunes and seawalls. Yet morale did not fracture. The pressure that Germany had expected to break the Americans instead revealed a different truth. The force advancing up the bluffs was not propelled by naivete or bravado, but by discipline and belief in the system supporting them. Units that had once faltered now pressed forward with the patience of soldiers who trusted both their training and the vast machine behind them. As night fell across Normandy, the scale of the day's events became impossible to deny. Smoke drifted inland from burning positions once considered immovable. Beachheads, fragile at dawn, had solidified into a continuous front. Commanders on both sides understood the meaning of what had happened. The Atlantic Wall, centerpiece of German strategy and symbol of its defensive confidence, had failed. And in that failure, the deeper misjudgment stood exposed. Germany had not merely underestimated American strength. It had misunderstood the nature of American war. The implications would echo far beyond the beaches, into every battlefield still to come. In the weeks following the landings, the beaches of Normandy transformed from fragile footholds into the foundation of an immense logistical engine. What began as narrow corridors carved through sand and shingle expanded into arteries flowing inland. Roads widened, depots constructed, airstrips assembled almost faster than they could be mapped. Ship after ship delivered tanks, fuel, rations, and replacement troops, creating a depth of supply that seemed to defy battlefield logic. To German observers, this rapid swelling of American strength appeared unnatural, almost impossible. They had expected attrition to erode the invading force. Instead, the beaches pulsed with growing vitality, each day adding new layers of capability. By July, the Americans prepared to shatter the stalemate that had formed along the bocage. The plan was Operation Cobra, an offensive built not merely on infantry maneuver, but on the concentrated power of air supremacy. Carpet bombing, on a scale previously reserved for cities, was directed against the German defensive belt west of St. Lo. When the bombers arrived, their formations stretched across the sky in dense geometric patterns. The earth trembled under the weight of thousands of explosives, turning hedgerows and fields into a churned expanse of dust and shattered timber. German positions that had resisted for weeks were thrown into confusion, their communication lines severed, their cohesion ruptured. Into this breach advanced the American mechanized forces, units whose doctrine had once been dismissed by the Wehrmacht as inexperienced and overly dependent on material. Yet in open country, the logic of American design revealed itself. Shermans advanced not as solitary predators, but as elements within a coordinated rhythm. Tanks supported by tank destroyers, infantry following closely, artillery responding with near-instantaneous fire missions. An army once judged by its early missteps now moved with the momentum of a tide. The Germans, who had prided themselves on tactical flexibility, found themselves reacting to an adversary capable of sustaining offensive pressure without pause. German commanders documented their astonishment in field reports. They noted not only the scale of American advances, but the unrelenting nature of them. A division shattered one day reappeared reinforced and re-equipped the next. Artillery shells arrived with a regularity the Germans could no longer match. Even the weather seemed unable to slow the Americans for long. Mud that halted German columns during earlier campaigns now merely adjusted the pace of U.S. supply trucks. The Wehrmacht's veterans, once confident in their ability to read an enemy, now struggled to comprehend how an army could fight so continuously and absorb its own losses without strategic hesitation. Encirclements began to multiply across the French countryside. The Americans, along with British and Canadian forces Essing from the north, exploited every German miscalculation in deployment. Villages that had changed hands repeatedly now fell with accelerating speed. Road junctions, once contested, became stepping stones toward deeper objectives. The pressure intensified until the German front, stressed beyond its limits, bent into a shape that history would remember, the Falaise Pocket. Here, amid dust, wreckage, and desperate fighting, the contradiction at the heart of German strategy became undeniable. They had dismissed American strength for years, assuming that industrial power could not be translated into battlefield mastery. Yet now, under the weight of converging Allied forces, their armies were being compressed into a narrowing corridor. Attempts to break out were met by coordinated artillery, air attacks, and armored thrusts that struck with precision. When the pocket finally collapsed, tens of thousands of German troops were killed, wounded, or captured. The remnants staggered eastward, broken not only by battle but by the recognition that their assumptions had turned against them. Mid this sweeping advance, the human dimension of transformation became visible. American soldiers who had once arrived in North Africa with uncertainty now displayed a calm professionalism. Platoon leaders navigated complex maneuvers with the confidence of long experience. Tank crews communicated in clipped, efficient exchanges honed through months of fighting. Medics moved through fields under fire, performing their duties with a steadiness that belied the chaos around them. These were not the soldiers German officers had mocked in 1942. These were veterans shaped by adversity, guided by doctrine, and supported by a national machine capable of replacing loss with renewed strength. As the breakthrough widened and the German defense continued to unravel, the larger meaning of the moment became clear. A nation once ridiculed for its supposed softness, its inexperience, its dependence on factories rather than fighters, had become an unstoppable force. It had learned from defeat, refined its methods, and built a system of war that expanded far beyond the front lines. The Americans no longer fought for survival or reputation. They fought with the assurance of an army that understood its own power. By the end of the Normandy campaign, France lay open before them, and the world that had once laughed at the idea of an American-led liberation now witnessed a transformation few had believed possible: the emergence of a military force capable of reshaping the European war. Ahead lay the crossing of rivers, the liberation of cities, and the final battles on German soil. But the turning point had already arrived. The army that marched eastward was the embodiment of a nation that had turned underestimation into momentum, and momentum into inevitability. In the years after the war, as German archives were opened and staff diaries examined, a pattern emerged with remarkable clarity. The underestimation of the United States had not been an isolated misreading or the opinion of a few overconfident officers. It had been systemic, woven into intelligence briefs, operational plans, and the strategic assumptions of the Reich. Reports repeatedly framed America as industrially powerful but militarily inept, a nation whose soldiers lacked the discipline for sustained operations, and whose commanders relied on rigid manuals rather than instinct. These judgments, comforting in the early years of victory, would later stand as some of the most consequential errors in modern military history. What the archives revealed, and what German commanders learned too late, was that America's strength did not lie in natural talent or inherited martial tradition. It emerged instead from relentless self-correction. Each failure, whether at Kasserine, in the hedgerows, or in the first chaotic hours on Omaha, was dissected with an honesty rare in wartime. Training was rewritten. Leadership was revised. Doctrine evolved. No mistake was allowed to remain unexamined, and no shortcoming went unaddressed. The Americans, far from brittle, proved astonishingly adaptable, able to transform battlefield pain into institutional improvement with a speed Germany could not match. As the campaign expanded beyond Normandy, these differences became impossible to ignore. German divisions, once the spearhead of European conquest, now crumbled under shortages they could neither prevent nor repair. Fuel arrived in quantities too small to support meaningful maneuver. Ammunition dwindled. Replacement troops rushed to the front with minimal training could not fill the gaps left by lost veterans. Their cohesion, the very heart of German tactical skill, began to unravel. Meanwhile, American units rotated through predictable cycles of rest, refit, and reinforcement. Supplies flowed with remarkable consistency. A battalion that lost a third of its strength in one engagement returned days later with its rank replenished, its equipment restored, and its morale anchored by the assurance that it would not be abandoned. Under this sustained pressure, the myth of American weakness dissolved. German officers who had once dismissed U.S. forces as inexperienced now watched them conduct river crossings, armored thrusts, and coordinated offensives on a scale Germany could no longer resist. Reports written from collapsing front lines described the Americans as persistent, methodical, and impossible to exhaust. The very traits once derided as plotting or unimaginative became sources of overwhelming strength. The Americans did not need brilliance to win. They required only the steadiness of a system designed to endure. Within this revelation lies a deeper truth about war and about nations. Strength is not born, it is learned. It is shaped by error, refined by discipline, and carried forward by institutions willing to confront their own flaws. Germany entered the war believing that inherited military superiority would carry it to victory. America entered believing it had much to learn. History would reward the latter. The consequences of arrogance echoed far beyond Normandy. They shaped every campaign that followed: the swift liberation of France, the crossing of the Rhine, and the relentless advance into the heart of the Reich. Each step reflected a shift that Germany had failed to anticipate: the transformation of an underestimated adversary into a force defined not by early setbacks, but by what those setbacks had taught. In the end, German generals confronted a sobering realization. The war had not been lost on the beaches of D-Day, nor in the Falaise pocket, nor even in the ruins of Berlin. It had been lost years earlier, in meeting rooms and briefing halls where an enemy's potential was dismissed with a confident laugh. The price of misjudgment was not merely defeat, it was the unraveling of everything they believed about their own superiority. And as the archives make plain, by the time that lesson was understood, the course of the war had already passed beyond their ability to change. As the Allied advance pressed deeper into France, the true nature of America's strength came into sharper focus. It was not embodied in a single weapon or brilliant commander, nor in any mythic reservoir of natural talent. It emerged instead from millions of citizens, ordinary men and women, who had been drawn into the vast machinery of war. They arrived from farms, factories, laboratories, and shipyards, bringing with them skills learned in civilian life, and repurposing them for a conflict that demanded precision at an unprecedented scale. In their collective effort, the United States revealed the quiet advantage that Germany had never fully understood: a nation capable of turning its entire society into craftsmen of war. This transformation was not dramatic. It unfolded in the hum of assembly lines, in the glow of furnaces, in the steady tick of drafting pencils on paper. Welders who once repaired tractors now joined the hulls of landing ships. Engineers who designed household appliances shifted to calculating stress tolerances on tank suspensions. Farmers supplied grain for armies spread across continents. The work was dispersed and often anonymous, yet it formed a single organism of national will, one that delivered material to Europe with a regularity that made the extraordinary feel routine. For the soldiers who faced this machine, the discovery was disorienting. German prisoners captured after the breakout described their astonishment at the abundance surrounding the Americans. They spoke of motor pools filled with more trucks than entire German divisions possessed, of ammunition dumps that stretched beyond sight, of replacement parts stocked so deeply that broken vehicles were repaired within hours. Some remarked, almost with disbelief, that the Americans seemed to treat equipment not as precious assets, but as tools to be used freely, replaced when necessary, and supported by an endless chain of supply. To men accustomed to rationing, salvaging, and improvising under constant shortages, this abundance felt unreal. Yet the American Army's character was not defined by excess. It was shaped instead by disciplined democracy, a force that prized method over spectacle, steady advance over abrupt brilliance. Orders flowed through clear channels. Units executed their missions with procedural rigor. Even the battlefield, chaotic as it was, reflected an underlying structure of roles, rehearsals, and routines. The Germans, who had long prided themselves on tactical improvisation, struggled to grasp the strength of this methodical approach. What seemed slow in theory proved unstoppable in practice. This contrast between expectation and reality became one of the campaign's enduring ironies. German officers entered the war certain that Americans lacked staying power, that a society built on comfort could not endure hardship, and that industry, capability alone could not compensate for martial tradition. But on the roads through Normandy and into the French interior, the opposite proved true. The Americans were not driven forward by ideology or inherited military pride. They advanced through a system that valued preparation, adaptation, and the steady improvement of individuals asked to do difficult things well. From this system emerged the figure that would come to define the conflict's moral center: the American soldier, not fearless but steady, not flamboyant but reliable. A man who carried his rifle, followed his orders, and trusted that the immense machine behind him, built by millions he would never meet, would provide what he needed to continue. His strength was quiet, measured not by dramatic heroics, but by the simple endurance of another march, another assault, another night in the rain-soaked fields of France. And in this quiet strength lay a lesson that Germany confronted only when it was too late. The arrogance of certainty had blinded it more effectively than any enemy deception. While it judged its opponent through the lens of past triumphs, that opponent evolved, expanded, and forged itself into something new, something capable of winning a war not through inherited superiority, but through the collective labor of ordinary people. Beyond the hedgerows, the campaign continued, but its moral shape was already clear. The force once dismissed had become both a symbol and an engine of transformation, and its momentum was still gathering. In the years after the guns fell silent, German commanders spoke with a candor that wartime pride had long concealed. In interviews, memoirs, and debriefings, they acknowledged a truth that had matured slowly in their understanding. They had misjudged the United States, not simply its military, but its capacity to wage war as an adaptive, industrial, self-correcting civilization. What they had interpreted as softness had been unfamiliarity. What they had considered disorder had been the early motion of a vast machine learning how to move. The revelation came not in 1942 or 1943, but in hindsight, when the scale and coherence of America's transformation could be seen without the distortions of ideology. Historians would later describe the arc from Kasserine to Normandy as one of the most dramatic military evolutions in modern history. The same army that had fractured under German maneuver warfare in the Tunisian hills re-emerged 2 years later as a force capable of planning and executing the largest amphibious assault ever attempted. That shift was not the product of a single reform or leader. It was the cumulative effect of training, reflection, industry, and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. Few armies in history had adapted so widely or so quickly. Veterans on both sides reflected on this transformation with gravity rather than triumph. German officers who had once written dismissive assessments of American soldiers now recalled the professionalism they encountered during the breakout into France, the calm coordination of armor and infantry, the discipline under fire, the relentless pace that seemed impossible to halt. American veterans, for their part, remembered the early humiliation of North Africa, the confusion, the missteps, the painful recognition that bravery alone could not compensate for inexperience. For many, the memory of that failure became a quiet lodestar, guiding their determination to never let it happen again. In this shared reflection lay a common lesson. Assumptions collapse quickly when confronted by an enemy willing to learn faster than expected. As decades passed, D-Day took on a symbolic meaning far larger than the battle itself. It became the moment when the American capacity for precision, discipline, and overwhelming resolve revealed its full shape. Naval gunfire timed to the second, airborne operations scattered yet purposeful, engineers carving passages through obstacles under fire, logistics humming across thousands of miles. The invasion reflected an understanding of war as a system rather than a series of isolated engagements. In its design and execution, D-Day represented not only military achievement, but the operational maturity of a nation that had refused to remain defined by its early failures. From this vantage, the moral of the campaign stands with unusual clarity. Never mistake inexperience for weakness. Never confuse untested capability with an absence of potential. Nations, like armies, often reveal their true character only when subjected to adversity, and those willing to learn from hardship may become stronger than those who dismiss them. Germany learned this lesson in the harshest way possible, not through intelligence reports or battlefield observation, but through the slow realization that the war had slipped beyond its control long before it recognized the danger. And so the story closes where it began, with the image of an armada stretching from horizon to horizon, advancing toward the beaches of Normandy. In its scale lay the visible reflection of an invisible process, a society awakening its full strength, a military forging itself from error, and an enemy realizing, too late, that the force it had once derided had become one of the most powerful armies in history. It moved steadily across the water, carrying with it the weight of a century about to be reshaped.